This is FRM Part II, Book 3, Operational Risk and Resiliency, and the chapter on stress testing banks. Now, this chapter is taken directly from the Journal of Forecasting, which is an academic journal which publishes articles that forecast all different sorts of variables. I bet you can imagine some of these articles in which professors and professionals either develop models or test models that attempt to forecast variables like interest rates and exchange rates and probably even mergers and acquisitions and maybe even dividend payments. So this is probably a fairly technical journal with each article having lots of statistics and econometrics in it. And of course, in this chapter, the author is trying to forecast measures of capital adequacy. Now, all good academic journal articles have an abstract, and this one is no different. And the beginning of this abstract asks a really interesting question, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but the question sounds like, how much capital does a bank need to support its risk-taking activities? And this is really a great question, one that we've been trying to answer in the previous couple of chapters. Now, as part of the answer, the author in its abstract suggests that traditional methods, like maybe some regulatory capital ratios, are probably no longer as appropriate or reasonable or valid as maybe they used to be. And so the author suggests that, of course, stress testing is at least part of the answer. And you'll see that when we look at these learning objectives. Notice there's only 3 of them. But we'll go ahead and start with an historical evolution of stress testing processes. And we'll go ahead and look at the European Banking Authority suggestions. We'll look at the U.S. Supervisory Capital Assessment Program. And we'll look at the Comprehensive Capital Analysis and Review, which we've done a little bit of that in a previous chapter. And then, just like we've been doing in recent chapters, we're going to explain challenges in designing stress test scenarios and in modeling a bank's, financial statements. If you look at the revenue, so there's the top right-hand side of the income statement. And then you have losses, whether or not you put them somewhere on the income statement or somewhere over on the balance sheet over a particular stress test horizon period. So let's go ahead and begin with just a simple question, one that we probably already know the answer to. What is a stress test? So here we go. Simulated exercise implemented to ascertain the resilience of a single bank, or, and this is important, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, or the entire banking sector in response to these adverse occurrences, which of course are unanticipated or unexpected, but ought to be planned for. So notice that second block point, we have bolded capital planning and capital adequacy. Those are terms with which you should be very familiar based on our discussions in previous chapters. Now, I have referenced capital budgeting multiple times in recent recordings, but notice that third block point, assess the bank's ability to balance cash inflows and cash outflows. So that sounds an awful lot like capital budgeting, but what's important here is that we're going to do this under a stressed scenario. I always refer to this in my family with my children as a stressed out scenario. We have lots of stresses in our life as a family, as I'm sure you do. And of course, it's no different inside of a financial institution. Take a look at this little illustration from the Fed. Notice in blue, we've got actual Tier 1 capital ratio. So remember, Tier 1 capital represents the very, very bottom of the right-hand side of the balance sheet for a financial institution. And so this ratio is probably that Tier 1 capital over, let's say, total assets. So look at actual ratios in blue for all of these large bank holding companies. The blue goes way, way out. Look, it's 14% or 15% or even exceeding 20%. But then when you recalculate this under worst case scenarios, in the reddish or rustish color, those ratios, of course, swing all the way back. And there's that minimum required right at about 4%. And so it looks like, here we are in 2017, it looks like these bank holding companies are in great shape. All right, so let's acknowledge that in 2017. But in order to get a really good understanding of stress testing, we need to kind of go back in history a little bit. So notice the next slide deck question asks, why did the stress testing, which has been around for decades, mind you, why did it fail back in 2008? And the simple answer is that these stress tests were kind of isolated stress test, stand-alone stress test, but they clearly were not comprehensive stress tests, right? So look at the first block point. The scenarios considered were too narrow and did not give a comprehensive representation. So we're asking the question, what's the worst case scenario? So let's just take myself here. You guys know I like to give personal examples. What's the worst thing that can happen to me financially? Forget about my children and my wife and all my friends and families. What's the worst thing that could happen to me financially is that I would lose my job, right? So that sounds like, let's go ahead and perform a stress test on Jim losing his job. And so then we can decide on what my assets are, what kind of jobs I can try to get going forward, what are my cash flows look like, inflows and outflows, etc. But that's one stress test, but that's narrow. Suppose that the reason that I lost my job was because of some criminal activity. And not only do I lose my job, but I lose my ability to generate income in the future because perhaps I go to jail or, something else. So do you see how you can this narrow first case scenario needs to be widened. Add that to the simple fact that complex and new products, going back to the 2000s, mortgage-backed securities sound like a pretty innocuous security, and yet they were, critical in this crisis that we had back in 2008. And look at what we've put in bold. They were left out entirely of this stress testing. So swinging back to my example, if we just leave out the fact that I was a criminal and lost my job, then we're going to perform a stress test, and we'll conclude something like, oh, you know what, Jim has a professional designation, he has a PhD, he has great student observation, so Jim will probably be able to get another job at some other institution, right? Well, if I have a criminal record, that pretty much wipes that out. So these complex and new products, and this is what we're studying here in all of these chapters. If you leave those out, it really sounds to me like stress testing is almost a waste of time, right? And then moving on to the third one, if we use simply historical data, we've talked about this in the past, that we're relying on the fact that history is going to repeat itself exactly over that window over which we have selected that historical data. Now we know history does repeat itself, but we don't know the timing of history repeating itself. And then look at those last two here. I have been emphasizing in previous recordings how important it is that the board of directors establishes a risk culture and that those boards hire senior leadership that is going to promote those kinds of cultures and ideas throughout the organization. So look at the bolded words there. General laxity. Not even senior management took stress testing seriously. Boy, let's go ahead and scratch ourselves together and think, all right, we're not going to let that history repeat itself when we have important jobs and important careers and important decisions to make about risk. And so that last one there, you're not surprised. Stress testing, not part of risk governance programs for many banks that operated throughout the world. So boy, if you can read these 5 reasons, and they're pretty compelling to give us a sense of why stress testing failed, and that's important that we don't allow history to repeat itself. So we need to make sure going forward that we include all 5 of those elements inside of any kind of a stress testing model that we develop. How about a comparison of 3 historical stress testing programs? So this goes back to one of those first learning objectives. All right, so the EBA, so we got this committee on banking supervision, so they released a set of principles that addresses those key weaknesses in stress testing. And let me go ahead and emphasize this once again. I've mentioned to you guys in previous recordings that my students do a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so that's pretty much what the set of principles is based on. All right, 21 principles. So what are we trying to emphasize? Integration of stress testing in risk governance. So what does that mean? Remember, we've got these business lines here, and it could be 10 of these different silos or business lines. And so there has to be integration between and among the risk culture and the risk governance procedures and policies inside and outside of each of those silos. Complementary risk perspective to other risk management tools. All right, so this is important. What do we know? Let's go back to just our basic risk management tool, standard deviation, which leads us into value at risk, which leads us into expected losses and expected exposure and all those kinds of things. So we have that measure of standard deviation, and we love standard deviation as a measure of risk under certain conditions. What we need to do is use stress testing as a complement to standard deviation and all those other variables and risk management tools that flow from it. Now, firm-wide participation means exactly what it suggests, that we've got this, we have this umbrella up here, and we got the chief risk officer. So this really talented man or woman is responsible for stress testing at each of those silos, but then integrating all of those silos with the risk culture and the risk appetite that was outlined by the board of directors. And then there's that word again, granular. So, we got this idea up here above the umbrella, and then those grains of sand fall all the way to the bottom of each of those silos, which means we need not only leadership, but we need leadership that's going to convince and advocate and, in fact, motivate all of the employees inside of each silo to take a firm-wide perspective on this particular type of a risk management tool. How about this SCAP here in the United States from the Fed, which was trying to provide some kind of guidelines over adequate capital. And this was the first time that any supervisory or government body divided the external environment and the internal environment. And so look at the circle points in there. So macroprudential stress testing involves the soundness of the banking system as a whole. So out of this idea, although it was talked about before, out of this idea was the concept of, too big to fail. So we've identified these banks or bank holding companies that we don't want to fail because they'll have their failure would have repercussions throughout the entire economy. And so the Fed is suggesting that we need to look at the entire financial system as a whole at the macro level, and then, of course, look at each individual organization, each individual financial institution at the micro level. And so this brings the question of, we've studied this a lot in investments and in risk management and in asset allocation. What do you do first? Do you do the macro first, or do you do the micro first, top down or bottom up? And essentially, it, from a global perspective, probably doesn't matter as long as you do each one well. And there's a nice little table down there to give you a summary of the difference between the pre and post this supervisory capital assessment program. And then the comprehensive capital analysis analysis and review, I think we had almost this exact same illustration in a previous chapter. So look in the middle there. You've got an effective capital adequacy process. And let me just remind you that one of those previous chapters used the words buffer and cushion to describe the importance of the bottom right-hand side of the balance sheet. And so notice that all of these arrows pointing outward into the different colors, sound risk management, effective governance, right? Capital policy and planning, internal controls, clear available capital resource estimate, and then, effective loss estimation. And so, this is what we have. We've got this system here, these building blocks over on this illustration. And what the Fed has also done here is to give banks an idea that it's important to look forward, not just at history. So, we've looked at these historical things in the past, but what we want to do is we also want to look forward in our stress test so that we can decide, all right, this is what happened in the past, and this is what we can do to prevent that same event from occurring in the future and having the repercussions and implications that it had. It's not like we're going to try to avoid any kind of a financial crisis, although that's part of the goal. But what we need to do is have tools in place so that we can manage that financial crisis much better than we have done in the past. Now, those last two learning objectives examine challenges. We've done this many, many times. So challenges in designing stress test scenarios. So the first one is that the stress test must be coherent. So there's a word that we've learned about in multiple previous chapters regarding a risk measure, right? Risk measures have to have those 4 properties of coherence. But here it's a little bit of a broader definition, all right? So coherence in this case under stress testing means that the scenarios must be extreme, right? We want to reach out to that far left tail of the distribution, but they can't be so extreme that they are considered to be unreasonable or outside the realm of possibility, right? We don't want to put together a stress test that considers the case of aliens coming down from some planet way out there and then blowing up the earth, right? That doesn't make any sense because it's probably not reasonable and it's probably not possible. I don't know what you guys think about UFOs and life outside of Earth, but nevertheless, if aliens are going to come, we probably need to worry less about our portfolios and risk management and more about, okay, what does our immediate future hold? All right, so notice there's another 4 reasons here that it's difficult to develop coherent stress tests. Risk factors keep on changing, right? So not only do we have a dynamic economy and those risk factors keep changing, and we know this from, simple multiple regression analysis to more complex regression models that includes things like heteroscedasticity and serial correlation and time series and all those things that we have studied. But notice that we've got some of these variables and risk factors that change in not only a non-linear manner, but also a non-uniform manner. So we're not quite sure what's going to happen. And so the example that the textbook gives is that, look, if we're trying to forecast exchange rates, and then if we're trying to use future exchange rates to as part of an input in our stress test, and if we're a global business, a global financial institution, and we have business in Canada and in Europe, well, we need to worry about US dollar changing value against the Canadian dollar and against the euro. And it might be that one time it appreciates against one, and it might be that it depreciates against another. And so trying to wrap your arms around these changing currency values is pretty difficult. Risk factors are multi-layered and multi-factored from an intrinsic or a core value. We know this. I mean, when we compute something like a standard deviation, we know that standard deviation measures total risk, right? Total meaning that there's nothing else out there. But when you break standard deviation into some of its components and you try to use it in some other frameworks, like in value at risk, it's probably really difficult to attribute, certain values of the components of standard deviation to a particular risk factor, like exchange rates, or like interest rates, or like credit risk, or operational risk. Yeah, look at number 3, complex and highly dimensional universe of portfolio positions. I mean, it's one thing for a financial institution to specialize in mortgage loans. So you can imagine what it looks like on the left-hand side of its balance sheet. You've got a mortgage loan for $50,000, and you have a mortgage loan for, let's pick a big number, say $10 million. And then you have the entire range in between there. And so how can you identify risk factors inside of that universe of portfolio positions that are common and that are unique to each, maybe individual or groups of individual loans? Over-reliance on historical scenarios. So we've said that before. How about if we're trying to model inside of this stress test critical variables in the financial statements, like revenues, like losses, and like capital over on the bottom right-hand side of the balance sheet. All right, so we've got 3 elements here. How can we translate macro risk factors like exchange rates and inflation into a stress testing for each individual financial institution? All right. So notice what's bolded in that first circle point. Micro financial forces pose even greater threats to financial stability, and the span of such threats is probably larger and more difficult to identify than what the historical models have shown. Geographical differences. We just need to go back to the 2008 financial crisis. And if you take a look at a picture of the United States divided into each of the counties inside of each state, and if you use the color green, let's say, for mortgage loans that are on time and are being repaid, and if you use the color red for those mortgages that are in default, and then you can have a whole range of colors in between, you'd look at this map, you can find hot spots, right? And so geographic factors have a deep impact. And so a bank that operates, let's say, in some county in Atlanta is probably different than a bank that operates in, let's say, Boise. And then, of course, we've got to worry about the business cycle, right? We have our clients who are borrowing at different stages in the business cycle. So we know the business cycle goes like this. We just don't know the distance between, this peak, and the next peaks, so it could be stretched out over years, right? Probably not decades, but years or months. And so it's, it's extremely difficult to model the business cycle inside of this particular stress test. And revenues are probably no different for some of those same reasons that I talked about on the previous slide. Look at that first element there, slow pace of development in revenue modeling. This is always interesting for me as an academic and who teaches his students to put together some type of an Excel spreadsheet in which we're estimating revenues, and this can be done inside of a money and banking class, or a financial institutions class, or even some kind of an investments class that we teach at our school. But when you're estimating those revenues in future time periods, revenues are really just P times Q, right? Price times quantity. So you have a quantity of these loans. The price, not really a dollar price, but it's going to be an interest rate. And so you have so many clients and so many borrowers who have floating rate loans, and even those that have fixed rate loans. We're not guaranteed to receive those fixed rate loans because of things like refinancing and default, et cetera, et cetera. And so couple that with the second one, the effect of fluctuating interest rates, it's really difficult to model interest income. Now, over on the balance sheet, we need to look at, of course, the depletion of capital. And so we've got, we have mergers, we have acquisitions, we have spin-offs, we have liquidations, we have all sorts of changes in the financial institutions industry that's going to affect that bottom right-hand side of the balance sheet. And then, of course, lots of financial institutions pay dividends. So we need to make certain that when the board declares and pays that dividend, that the cash flows have warranted that dividend payment, and those cash flows can only have been warranted if we've passed all of these stress tests that we're talking about. And that takes us through this relatively short chapter. And so I would know all three of these. I mean, you can ask 3 really good questions on an exam, based on those 3 models and then based on challenges. And then it's probably helpful to augment all the challenges that we've talked about in previous slide decks with these challenges here.